Okay, so I have quite a long list of questions, 12 questions to be precise. I'll do my best to answer them. And just to preface this, I had difficulty understanding some of the things Geshe-la said this morning, so please don't expect me to be able to explain them and clarify them. But yeah, some very good questions came in. Okay, so the first one here is, could you please review what Geshe-la said about the root of cyclic existence according to each school? And this is what I heard, the questioners repeating what they thought Geshe-la was saying. Vibhashikas identify the root of cyclic existence to be desire. Sautrantikas say it's grasping at the self-sufficient, substantially existent person. Chittamatrans maintain the above, but identify two other culprits. And then going on to Yogacaras, Svatantrika, and Prasangika. So I'll do these one by one. But actually, I was surprised myself by some of the things that Geshe-la said. Because what I have learned, for example, when I studied the Madhyamika Avatar, this point came up about what is the root of cyclic existence. And what we were told is that all the schools other than Madhyamika Prasangika identify the root of cyclic existence to be the grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. So that means that state of mind, it's ignorance, it's a kind of ignorance grasping at a certain kind of self, a certain kind of I, as existing in that way, self-sufficient, substantially existent. So as long as we have that mind, that aspect of the mind, we remain in samsara. We cannot attain liberation from samsara. And so if we want to attain liberation from samsara and even go further than that, attain enlightenment, that's the main thing that needs to be eliminated. We need to free ourselves from that to attain liberation from samsara. So yeah, Geshe-la did seem to say this morning that according to the Vaibhashika school, well, I'll just read what he said in my notes. I didn't write down everything, but let me see what he said. He said, Vaibhashika do speak of self-grasping, grasping at a self of persons, but in a very gross way, saying that the person is the collection of aggregates. They deny a permanent, unitary, independent self, but without saying that it's the root of suffering. Instead, they point to desire or craving as the root of suffering. So I found that interesting, what he said, because it does differ than, and I think in the Tenets books as well, if those of you who have studied Tenets, that's usually what they say, that according to Vaibhashika, what needs to be overcome to be free of samsara is grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. You've heard that as well? Yeah, so, but on the other hand, here at the Abbey, we're studying the Pramanavartika by Dharmakirti. And he is, I guess he's regarded as Chittamatra, but he also expresses some Sautrantika views. It's a little unclear to me exactly which school he belongs to. But I'm kind of preparing our next review class on that. And I just came to a verse where he is saying desire is the cause of suffering. So he seems to be saying desire is the main thing that we need to overcome to be free of suffering. But then we have Gyaltsabje's commentary to Dharmakirti, and Gyaltsabje is adding some additional words. So in Gyaltsabje's commentary, what he's saying is desire is a cooperative condition for samsara, for suffering. And the main cause is self-grasping ignorance. So I don't know if that's what really Dharmakirti really intended to say or not. Hard to say. Also, in the Buddha's first teaching, the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, the Dhammachakra Sutra, where he explains the Four Noble Truths. I don't know if you read that. There's English translations available. But there, where he teaches the second noble truth, the truth of the cause of suffering, the origin of suffering, he says it's desire. Desire, craving is the cause of suffering. And then normally in our tradition, we say ignorance. Ignorance is the cause of suffering. And I've heard the Dalai Lama say, I can't remember the exact words, but he's saying ignorance is the root cause. Ignorance, grasping at things as inherently existing, is the root cause of suffering. And desire is like a proximate cause, or maybe also like a contributing cause, because desire for sure is a big problem. But if we say that desire is the root of samsara, then all we have to do is be free of desire in order to be free of samsara. But what about ignorance? On the other hand, how to be free of desire, how to eliminate desire. According to our school, the way to eliminate desire is to eliminate ignorance, because ignorance is the root of desire. So I don't know, these are just a lot of different thoughts I have about that, but I was surprised myself by what Geshe-la said, and maybe we can ask him tomorrow to clarify that. And Satrantikas, yeah. So again, as I say, what I've learned before is that all the schools, except for Prasangika, say that the root of samsara is grasping at a self, in particular, self-sufficient, substantially existent person. This is a sense of a self that seems to be like a boss, like a CEO, the director of operations. You know, I think we can notice that sometimes. There seems to be an I in there that's in charge, making decisions, you know, controlling our body and mind. So that sense of an I, grasping at, believing in such an I, is a kind of ignorance, self-grasping ignorance. And that's the thing that needs to be overcome to be free of samsara. However, according to Prasangika, their view is different than all the other schools. They say that kind of ignorance is gross, is coarse. And there's a subtler kind of ignorance, self-grasping ignorance, that grasps at inherently existing or intrinsically existing I, self, and also all phenomena, our body, our mind, all the phenomena in the world around us. So the ignorance that sees all things as inherently or intrinsically existing, that's the root of samsara. That's the thing that has to be eliminated if we want to attain liberation from samsara, if we want to attain enlightenment. And they say this is true whatever, yeah, so both for bodhisattvas who wish to attain full enlightenment, Buddhahood, but also for hearers and solitary realizers whose goal is personal liberation, or solitary peace, it's sometimes called. This is freeing oneself from samsara, attaining nirvana. So Prasangika says, even those practitioners have to realize emptiness of inherent existence of all phenomena in order to attain nirvana. And this is also a different point of view than the other schools. It gets very complicated. And Geshe-la did kind of allude to that this morning. The other branch of Madhyamika, this Madhyamika Svatantrika, there's actually two branches of that. There's it's Sautrantikas, Svatantrika, Madhyamikas, and the Yogacharas, Svatantrika, Madhyamikas. Yeah, that's why it's helpful to study tenets and get familiar with these different terms. But yeah, even within the Svatantrika Madhyamikas, there are these two branches. One, they're called Sautrantikas Svatantrikas because their tenets are more similar to the Sautrantikas, the sutra followers. The other branch, the Yogacara Svatantrikas, are so called because some of their tenets are similar to Yogacara or Chittamatra, the mind-only school. So the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamikas have an explanation of, Geshe mentioned this, Geshe mentioned this morning, three different, he was talking about three different culprits that are caught. Yeah, but he didn't sort of elaborate on it. So they say that there's three types of practitioners. There's the hearers or Shravakas, whose goal is personal liberation. There's the solitary realizers, the Pratyeka Buddhas, who also aspire for liberation, but spend more time on the path, accumulating more merit. And then there's the Bodhisattvas, who aspire for Buddhahood, complete enlightenment. So there's these three different paths, or actually they call them vehicles, three different vehicles for three different types of persons. And each of them has a different principal object of meditation in order to achieve their goal. The first one, the hearers, the Shravakas, their main object of meditation is, as before, the selflessness of persons, the absence of a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. So that's what they meditate on. That's what they realize. And by means of that, they attain their respective nirvana, although it's actually called enlightenment. They do use the word enlightenment. Hearers enlightenment. Hearers enlightenment. So the word enlightenment, yeah, it's tricky. It doesn't always refer to Buddhahood. It can refer to other goals. The second type of person, the solitary realizers, or the Pratyeka Buddhas, so their goal is also nirvana, but it's called the solitary realizers enlightenment. And what they meditate on in order to attain that goal is, it's the same as in the Chittamatra system, non-duality. Sometimes it's called non-duality. That's a kind of simple way of talking about it. It means that the subject and object, that means like a mind, eye consciousness, seeing the color blue, for example, and its object, the blue color that is seen, that those two things are not of different natures or different substances because they both arise from the same cause, seed on the mind. So, yeah, if you study the mind-only school, you might be familiar with this. So they say there's a kind of ignorance that believes that the mind, eye consciousness seeing blue, and the blue that it sees are different substances, different natures. They don't arise from the same cause. So it seems like the blue is out there, existing separate from, independent of, unrelated to the mind. And that's true with all the things that we see, everything that we see. We see things as externally existent, independent of the mind, separate from the mind, not dependent on the mind. So they say that's a kind of ignorance that needs to be overcome. And the Pratyeka Buddhas, the solitary realizers, meditate on that and come to a realization of non-duality, that kind of non-duality. And in that way, they attain their respective goal of solitary realizers' enlightenment. Then there's the Bodhisattvas, and their goal is Buddhahood. They want to become a Buddha to help all living beings. And what they meditate on to attain Buddhahood is emptiness of true existence. Emptiness of true existence. This is, and again, this is the Majjhimika. This is Svatantrika, Sutrantika, Majjhimika, Svatantrika, Yogacara, Svatantrika, Majjhimika. So they're in the Majjhimika school. So they say things do not exist truly. Things are empty of true existence. They don't use the word inherent existence. They say they deny inherent existence only on the ultimate level, but not on the conventional level. It gets complicated. So anyway, so for them, bodhisattvas to attain Buddhahood need to meditate on the emptiness of true existence, the absence of true existence. They meditate on that and gain a realization of that, and that is how they attain enlightenment. So those are the three things that Geshe-la just kind of briefly mentioned, the three different culprits. But still, even that school, even though they say there's these three different objects that are meditated on by the three different kinds of persons, they still say the root of samsara is grasping at a self of persons, because that's what you need to do. That's what you need to realize in order to be free of samsara. If you just want to get out of samsara, that's all you want to do, then all you need to do is realize that kind of selflessness, absence of a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. And the Chittamatras, the mind-only school, they say that as well. To be free of samsara, you only have to realize that. But if you want to reach Buddhahood, if you want to follow the Bodhisattva's path, become Buddha, fully enlightened, then you need to realize the emptiness of duality. According to them, what prevents enlightenment is believing in external phenomena, external, things existing externally. So I don't know if this is helpful or just making things more complicated. Geshe-la did kind of go through it very quickly, and he didn't kind of mention all the details. But like I say, what I've heard before is that all the schools up to Prasangika say that the root of samsara is grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. So what he did say this morning was somewhat different than what I had heard before. Anyway, as you can see, tenets is complicated. Okay, next question is, what do you think of the merits and or problems of using the term paradigm to translate drupta? Drupta is what we normally translate as tenets. For instance, in physics, there's the classic paradigm of Newton, Laplace, Galileo, and then the quantum paradigm. They have certain fundamental differences, but at the same time have many shared background assumptions, research methods, and beliefs. They both coexist in one time, and an individual person can switch from accepting one to accepting the other. Does this seem to correspond to how the various drupta are related? I'm not so familiar with the term paradigm. It's not part of my vocabulary because I don't fully understand it. But I just want to read an etymology of the term drupta from Geshe Zopa's book, Cutting Through Appearances. So the etymology for this term that we usually translate as tenet is, it literally means, drupta means an established conclusion. It's a thesis decided upon and established in reliance upon scriptures and or reasoning, and which, from the perspective of one's mind, will not be forsaken for something else. Although I guess that's only temporarily, because if you get into a debate with someone who's holding a different point of view and they manage to convince you that your tenet is wrong, you might give that one up and take on the other person. So it seems that for a period of time, you hold on to this particular view quite solidly and try to defend it, but you could also change over, as we saw with Vasubandhu, who started off as a Vaibhashika and later became a Sutrantika, and then later became a Chittamatra. So he switched. So you certainly can switch from one tenet system to another. So I don't know. Did anyone here have any ideas about the word paradigm? Do you think paradigm is a good term for Drupta, tenet? I tend to think of paradigm more as a worldview.
Might be a little too broad.
Where's the microphone?
I remember correctly, the first day Geshe Dado was saying that one of the authors of Tenets texts viewed each school as its own worldview, and that you had to learn how to see the world through that view before then you can go on to the next one. So in that sense, it is kind of like a paradigm.
Mm. Yeah. So maybe. I don't know. Yeah, because the dictionary says different meanings of paradigm, but one is a worldview underlying the theories and methodology of a particular scientific subject. But I don't think it has to be only science. It could be other disciplines as well. So maybe. Okay, then. Okay, third question. How much of the debate between the various schools really speaks more to the depth of actual practice versus differences in what the Buddha taught? In my experience from the various Chinese schools of Buddhism, these ways of understanding mutually flow into each other. So a Tiantai practitioner might easily be able to see the confluence between Yogacara and Madhyamika. There's a famous story of Hui Ning and his analogy of polishing the mirror. We have two different takes on the same thing, essentially. For example, in evening service in Chinese monasteries, we'll often chant a line that everything comes from the mind, but a Chan practitioner would turn around and say, what is the mind? So I don't know, I don't have so much experience with what he or she is talking about here in the Chinese tradition. But I think my understanding is the main point of these different schools, different tenet schools, as Geshe-la has been pointing out, is we're trying to find out what is the cause of suffering. Why are we suffering? Why are we in samsara? And why are we unable to break free of this situation, to get out of samsara? What is it we have to do in order to break free of samsara? That's one of the most important questions, one of the most important topics of these different systems. And as he's saying, they kind of they start from a more gross level, a more, well, he kind of even said childish, maybe less mature, a less mature to a more mature level in terms of searching for the root of suffering, what it is. I mean, they all say it's something within our mind rather than something out there. So that's already pretty mature. They're not trying to fix the outside world. They're trying to fix one's own mind. But then in terms of, our mind is very, very complex. There's lots of different things lots of different afflictions and views and conceptions and so on in our mind. So among all of those, what is the thing that's really keeping us in samsara, keeping us, preventing us from attaining liberation and enlightenment? So that's kind of a really important question. So I don't think it's just a question of practice, because there's all kinds of different practices, and but the main practice really is the practice of wisdom, cultivating the mind that is able to understand the true nature of things, to be able to uproot the main cause of suffering, the main cause of being in samsara. So one can engage in all kinds of different practices, reciting mantras, develop single-pointed concentration, meditate on loving kindness and compassion. I mean, there's millions of different practices within Buddhism. But will any of those practices enable one to be free of samsara by itself? If you just do one of the, or more than one of those practices on their own, will that enable you to be free of samsara? So I don't know. Maybe I'm not quite answering the question, but what's explained in our tradition, which is really from the Madhyamika point of view, is that, yeah, you can spend lifetimes doing different kinds of practices, but until you have gained the wisdom directly seeing emptiness of inherent existence, intrinsic existence, that specific kind of mind, that specific kind of wisdom, until you've gained that, you will just keep circling in samsara. I mean, the other practices, of course, are very important. We need to cultivate compassion and love and ethics and generosity and concentration and so on. So all those other practices are complementary, but the main practice is really developing this wisdom. It's like Shantideva says in the first line of his ninth chapter of the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. Buddha taught all these other practices for the purpose of wisdom. So all the other practices, the first 5 perfections and everything else, is really taught to help the mind gain that wisdom, realizing emptiness, because that's the only thing that will completely cut the ignorance that keeps us in samsara. But then, a lot of practices are similar between the different schools. They're not like totally, with great big, 20-story walls in between them, but they all meditate on the Four Noble Truths. Followers of all the schools meditate on the Four Noble Truths and practice ethics and cultivate loving kindness and compassion and so on. So there's a lot that's in common, a lot of overlap between the schools. But when it comes to the view of reality, how things exist, what kind of ignorance keeps us in samsara, needs to be overcome, there they differ. So from that point of view, it would be difficult to have a foot in both worlds, to be both Chittamatra and Madhyamika, and that with respect to that particular point of view. With respect to other things, they would agree. Compassion, love, bodhicitta, definitely, they would agree on that. But when it comes to defining ignorance, the ignorance that needs to be overcome to attain enlightenment, there would be no compromise there. Okay, so anyway, that's as much as I can say about that. Number 4, is person an abstract composite because it is an imputation and dependence on a basis, the aggregates? If the answer is yes, then why is the conventionally imputed apple, not the basis apple, independence upon its basis, not also an abstract composite. So my understanding is abstract composite, this is a particular division of phenomena. So I think in all Buddhist schools, they agree on dividing phenomena, existent things, into two groups, permanent and impermanent. So whatever exists is either permanent or impermanent. And impermanent things, impermanent phenomena, are things that arise from causes and conditions and that change momentarily. That's the main characteristics of impermanent phenomena. Permanent phenomena, on the other hand, do not arise from causes and conditions, do not change moment by moment. So let's put those aside for now, and focus on impermanent phenomena, because they are subdivided into three types. There's three types of impermanent phenomena. One is called form, and that's physical things, physical matter, whatever's made of, physical things. So like our bodies, the table, most of the things in the world around us that we see. The second is consciousness. So that includes all the aspects of our mind, primary mind or main mind, 6 types of main minds, and all the mental factors. And so mind is defined as clear and knowing, that which is clear and knowing. So it's non-physical, but it can have these different aspects, different kinds of main minds, different kinds of mental factors. And then there's a third division of impermanent phenomena, which, it's sometimes translated as abstract composite, or another translation is non-associated compositional factors, which is actually a more precise translation of the Tibetan term. And that includes all impermanent things that don't fit into the other two categories. So impermanent things that are neither form nor consciousness. So that's the criteria for saying that something is an abstract composite. It's an impermanent phenomena, something impermanent, that is neither form nor consciousness. And person, one example of an abstract composite is person. And person is person or being or self, those are pretty interchangeable, is generally defined as the I that is imputed in relation to the aggregates, 4 or 5 aggregates. So it is true that person is just imputed, and probably most of the other abstract composites are also imputed. Another example is time and all the different divisions of time, like year, month, day, hour, minute, second. So those are also abstract composites. And what's some other examples of abstract composites? They do, huh? Yeah. Seasons also, like winter, fall. And they do say place. I tend to think of like Sravasti Abbey. It's just named onto this collection of land, buildings, people, and so on. Or a city, Seattle. Seattle is just labeled onto a particular piece of land and buildings and people and cars and so on. So I think it's true that they are imputed. They are imputed things. But I don't think that the reason these are considered abstract composites is only because they are imputed. Because if that was the case, then according to the Madhyamika Prasangika school, everything would be an abstract composite. And they don't say that. They still, as far as I know, they still maintain these different categories of phenomena. There's permanent things, there's impermanent things, and within impermanent things, there's these three types: consciousness, form, and abstract composites. So they still talk about those categories of phenomena. That's my understanding. So yes, Prasangika says everything is imputed, but that doesn't mean everything is an abstract composite. Okay, number 5 is asking about the seeds of our actions, karma, going from one life to the next. This is kind of confusing, this question. It says, how does the seeds of our action, our karma, goes to our next rebirth if the mind and matter are selfless, in parentheses, non-existent? We say with the flow of consciousness, but is consciousness itself not an aggregation and does not exist? So there's some confusion here. No Buddhist school would say that the mind does not exist and that matter does not exist. Selflessness does not mean non-existent. Okay, so that is not the meaning of selflessness. When we talk about selflessness or emptiness, it's a certain way of existence, a certain mode of existence that's being refuted, that's being negated, but not existence itself. Okay, selflessness doesn't mean non-existence. Emptiness doesn't mean non-existence altogether. When we say, for example, a person like myself, selflessness or emptiness means a certain way of existing of me, of myself. And that would differ from one school to another. The Madhyamika Prasangikas say the main kind of selflessness is emptiness or absence of inherent existence, intrinsic existence, which means a self that exists all on its own, not depending on causes and conditions, not depending on parts, not depending on being labeled by the mind. That kind of self is being refuted, is being denied. But it's not saying there's no person, there's no self at all. So that's important to understand. Selflessness does not mean non-existence. So this thing about karma, karmic seeds going from one life to the next, this is complicated. Each school has a somewhat different way of explaining it, and I can't remember how it goes, but it's also quite complicated. But just a simple way of saying it is, when we do an action, let's say a virtuous action. Let's use a virtuous action, doing prostrations to the Buddha with devotion. So we do that here every day, many times. So if we prostrate to the Buddha with devotion, with faith, that's a virtuous action. That action leaves an imprint. We use the word seed, but don't think of a seed like a barley seed or a corn seed. It's some kind of imprint. That's another example of an abstract composite. So seeds are karmic seeds, karmic imprints are abstract composites. So those are somehow left on the mind, imprinted in the mind, and they stay with the mind. As the mind is impermanent, it's changing moment by moment by moment, but these seeds remain on the mind unless they're counteracted somehow, like negative karmic seeds can get purified. We can purify them, although it's really only the realization of emptiness that completely wipes them out. But we can still reduce the severity of them by doing purification practices. And then virtue, the seeds of virtue, they can be wiped out. Well, not completely wiped out, but reduced or damaged if we get angry or generate wrong views and so on. So we don't want to do that. We have to avoid that. But anyway, if there's no sort of counteraction to these karmic seeds, they stay in the mind all through our life. And then when we die, our mind, well, there's a whole process of how the mind goes from a gross level to the most subtle level, the clear light mind. And then that is what transfers to the next life with the seeds, the imprints of our karmic actions. So they stay on the mind, life after life, until the right conditions come together and they ripen and bring their results. So this can all happen within emptiness of inherent existence. So even though karma is empty, it doesn't exist inherently, the person doing the action, doesn't exist inherently, the mind doesn't exist inherently, the karmic seeds don't exist inherently. So all these things are empty of inherent existence or independent existence, but it still functions. And this is actually a very, very important thing to understand, because sometimes when people meditate on emptiness and they start getting some understanding of emptiness, they go too far and end up having what's called a nihilist view, nihilism idea that, oh, nothing exists, I don't exist, karma doesn't exist, actions don't exist. So then that becomes very dangerous, because then you can end up doing things, doing negative actions, and you will experience suffering as a result of that. So we have to be very careful. They say we have to be very careful in our study of selflessness and emptiness, that we don't go too far and deny karma. Our understanding of emptiness should support our understanding of karma, our conviction in karma, our determination to live according to karma. So it takes a while, of course, to get to that point, to be able to understand all of that, but it is important. Okay, number 6. When I touch the table, what am I touching? Am I touching the basis, dependence on which table is designated? I think so. I think when we touch the table, what we're touching is the basis of imputation of table. Because table is a label. Table is a label. Table is a name, a label given to this collection of parts, wood, varnish, nails, and so on. So what we are touching is just the basis of designation of table. Similarly, when I look at tashi, can I say I am looking at part of the basis, the form aggregate, independence on which I designate tashi? Yes, we are seeing the basis of imputation of tashi, and only part of it, because we can't see tashi's mind unless you have clairvoyance. So we just see tashi's body, and probably just part of the body, but like Geshe-la mentioned, all you have to see is one part, like the head. You might see his head on top of a wall, sticking up above a wall. You don't see the rest of him, but just by seeing the head, you can say, oh, that's tashi. Yeah, so it's just the basis of designation that is seen and touched and so on. Number 7, we hear about how things are dependent upon their parts. Doesn't this work both ways, such as a spoke is only a spoke in dependence upon the existence of a wheel? A team member is only a member in dependence upon the existence of a team. Yes, and actually Chandrakirti in his Madhyamika talks about this. I can't remember exactly where, but yeah, using the example of the chariot, if you take the chariot apart, put all the parts down on the ground, you don't have a chariot anymore. But also, you can't even, strictly speaking, you can't even say these are the parts of the chariot, because they are only the parts of a chariot when there's a chariot. So it's like we have auto parts stores. We have stores that sell auto parts. So you walk into that store and there's all these things hanging on the wall and in the drawers and so on and so forth. But are they really auto parts? When they're hanging on the wall in the auto parts store, are they auto parts? Conventionally, yeah, we say them because you can take that auto part and put it into your car and make it part of your car. But if it's not actually part of a car, if it's just in the auto parts store hanging on the wall, not really an auto part. So it only becomes an auto part, strictly speaking, when it is part of an auto, when there is an auto, a car that's there, and that part is part of it. So yeah, even the parts depend on the whole. So there's that interdependence of parts and whole. Okay, number 8. There seem to be different levels of designation. Some seem to have more solid basis than others. For example, designating clapping as praise or disapproval. Because they say, you know, in most Western cultures, clapping the hands is praise, you know, we're happy. We like the performer, we like the performance. But in Tibetan society, they say clapping the hands is a sign of disapproval. Like when the, huh? Yeah. So like the Tibetans would be clapping at the Chinese. The Chinese misinterpreted it. They were actually saying, get out. So anyway, yeah, so clapping can have different, can be designated in different ways. Designating certain sound as music or noise, designating the drawing M as letter M, designating water as water, or designating Buddha as Buddha. Is this an indication it is not mere designation by the mind, in that there is something else at play? Not sure if I completely understand what's being asked here. Maybe it almost sounds like some things are more real than others. I mean, what I've heard, what I've understood is that because the Svatantrika school, when they're debating with the Prasangika school, will say, according to you, if you say everything is merely designated by the mind, then we could give any name to any object and it would become that. If all there is naming, labeling by the mind, then we could call something gold. We could say this is solid gold and it would be gold. And so I think Venerable Children is talking about how there's different points of view about this, but the way I've learned it is that the Prasangikas say, no, you cannot give any name to any object. There has to be a valid basis of imputation. So I guess there's debate about this, because I guess some people would say, well, if you say it's a valid basis of imputation, aren't you saying there's something there in the object, something inherent there in the object? So this is a tricky one, and I don't know the answer to it. But the Prasangikas would definitely say, no, you can't just give any name to any object, obviously. And they talk about 3 criteria. This is actually Lama Tsongkhapa talks about these 3 criteria. One is that it has to be conventionally known. So conventionally, for example, we call this a computer. At some point in time, computers were invented. I don't know who came up with the term computer. Bill Gates? No. Anyway, somebody in the process of inventing computers. I think in the old days, they were enormous things that would fill like a whole room. So the word computer, the name computer, was given to this kind of phenomena that's able to do these kind of functions. And so it just became conventionally known, at least in the English language, that this, the word computer is the term for this kind of phenomena, this kind of object. So we just go along with that. We use the word computer. And then for it being a computer, it cannot be invalidated by another conventional valid cognizer, meaning that nobody should be able to have a valid cognition that refutes or denies or invalidates this being a computer. So it being a computer can't be invalidated by another valid cognizer, conventional valid cognizer. And the third criteria is it cannot be invalidated by an ultimate valid cognizer. But an ultimate valid cognizer means a valid cognizer understanding ultimate truth, understanding emptiness. So that kind of mind also cannot invalidate it being a computer. So those are the three criteria. And if something can pass that test, those three criteria, then it's okay to say conventionally, this is a computer. So the expression when it says merely imputed or merely designated by the mind shouldn't be taken too literally, and meaning all you have to do is have a mind that gives a name or a label to something. That's not enough. It needs to be more than that. It does need to be some kind of validity to the imputation. And also when, I remember hearing from my teachers that the term mere, saying mere or merely, refutes inherent existence. That's the function of that term, merely. Merely means it's not inherently existing. Other than being labeled by the mind, it doesn't exist on its own, from its own side, objectively. So I don't know if that answers that question, but this whole point about saying things are merely imputed by the mind, I can't remember if Geshe-la said this or not, but what I've heard is that's more difficult to understand than emptiness. How things exist conventionally, the way in which things exist conventionally as merely labeled by the mind, can only be really understood after you've realized emptiness. Have you heard that? So that means that's more difficult to understand than understanding emptiness. So we can talk about it, we can think about it, we can try to understand it, but we can't really understand it until we've refuted inherent existence and gained a realization of emptiness, at least an intellectual, conceptual realization. I don't think it has to be direct. So it's not easy to understand what that really means. Do you think we have time for one more? Oh, 3:30. Oh, I thought it was 3. Okay. Okay, number 9 is, can you please review and elaborate on the 3 ways of dependent origination? The first one, the way it's written here is cause of dependency. I think what Geshe-la was saying, causal dependency. Causal dependency. And what that means is dependent on causes and conditions. So that means it only applies to impermanent things, not permanent things. Permanent things do not depend on causes and conditions, but all impermanent phenomena, form, mind, and abstract composites, depend on causes and conditions. So this is not too difficult to understand. Our bodies, for example, our bodies didn't always exist, but they came into existence in our mother's womb, coming together of the sperm and the egg, tiny little zygote, grew, turned into a fetus and a baby, got born. So all those causes and conditions that gave rise to our body. Okay, so our body depends on those causes and conditions. And also it continues to depend on causes and conditions. To be able to continue to be alive and not a corpse, we need food, we need air to breathe, we need health, you know, if something goes wrong, something malfunctions in our, especially in our heart or our brain, then our body won't continue. So moment by moment, all through our life, our body is dependent on causes and conditions to continue to exist. So it's the same with all impermanent phenomena. They depend on causes and conditions. So that's the first kind of dependency. The second one, yeah, I guess I use this funny word. I found it in the dictionary. It's MEREOLOGY. Mereology. I'd never heard that before. But the dictionary says, the abstract study of the relations between parts and wholes. So that's mereology, and then mereological is the adjective. Yeah, so that means things dependent on parts. And this is true of all phenomena, both impermanent and permanent. So our body, that's easy to understand. It's made up of all these different parts: skin, blood, bones, organs, cells, atoms, molecules, and so on. And so with impermanent things, it's not too difficult, especially if we think in terms of molecules, atoms, subatomic particles. So everything's made up of parts. With permanent things, it's trickier. An example of a permanent phenomena they often give is space, uncompounded space. So how does space have parts? Directional parts. So like in this room, there's space in this room. So we can say the space in the back of the room, the space in the front of the room, the space on the right side, the space on the left side. Or if you're outside, you can say the east, the west, the south, the north. So those are parts of space. Emptiness is a permanent phenomena. So how does that have parts? Parts of emptiness?
Emptiness of the cup, emptiness of the table.
Right. So every phenomena, everything that exists has emptiness as its, you can say like its quality, its ultimate nature, its real way of existing. So there's an emptiness for each and every phenomena. Even though it's all the same, kind of basically, emptiness isn't different from one phenomenon. The emptiness of the cup and the emptiness of my body are not really different. It's emptiness of inherent existence. But still, if the cup gets destroyed, its emptiness goes out of existence. But that doesn't make the emptiness of my body go out of existence. That's still there. And that's how we can see that emptiness has parts. And emptiness can go out of existence if the basis of that emptiness, the object that has that emptiness as its quality, when that object goes out of existence, its emptiness also goes out of existence. It doesn't continue existing. Like when my body dies and gets burned up, no longer existing. So the emptiness of my body will not continue to be there, will not continue to exist. It goes out of existence. But that doesn't mean emptiness itself goes out of existence. There's still lots of other emptinesses. Everybody else's bodies and minds and all the cups and tables and chairs and so on. So emptiness has different parts too. So a phenomena, any phenomena that you take as an example is made up of parts. And if those parts are not there, that object will not be there. That phenomenon will not be there. So that's how a phenomenon depends on its parts. It only exists because its parts exist. And if the parts I mean, a certain amount of parts can be taken away before it goes out of existence. Like a body, can lose certain parts of it, but still exist. But at a certain point, you take too many parts away, it's not going to exist anymore. When you take all the four wheels off of a car, well, the body of the car is still there, but it can't really function anymore as a car. So, yeah. So anyway, parts is another way that things are dependent on their parts. And the third one is the most difficult to understand, and I can't say I really understand it. Dependence on conceptual designation. So body, when we say body, my body, your body, any body, it depends on being labeled body. Without a mind conceptualizing and labeling body, then there's no body. Nobody. So it's the same with any object. There's a basis, parts, a bunch of parts put together in a certain way, and then we give it a name, we give it a label, like book, computer, body, cup. And the name or the label, is just conceptually created, conceptually imputed, designated. It's not existing in the object itself. It's not something that can be found in the object itself. You look through all the parts of an object, you cannot find that object as it's labeled. You cannot find body if you look at all the different parts. None of the parts individually is a body, and the collection of parts is also not body. So body is just named or labeled on top of the parts and the collection of parts. So that's the rough meaning. But to really understand that, again, they say you have to understand emptiness first before you can really understand how things are just dependent on being conceptually labeled, designated. Part of the question here is, what is meant by the flip side? Does anyone remember what Geshe-la said about that? I seem to recall he said something about flip side. Yeah, I remember him saying the two sides of a coin, conventional existence and ultimate existence being two sides of a coin. Yeah.
He said this level of dependence was the flip side of emptiness. This third level.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, because I've heard it said, well, we had discussion about this in Jeffrey's class. I've heard it said, and Venerable Children said it as well, that they say that to really understand dependent origination, you need to understand this third one. It's not enough just to understand the first two, that things are dependent on causes, conditions, things are dependent on parts. That's not enough to really understand emptiness. You have to understand how things are dependent on conceptual designation. But then in Jeffrey's class, we had different. You pointed some quotes in the text about causal dependency. Just with that alone, you can understand emptiness. Yeah, I was puzzled by that. But I guess maybe it's because it's really, really deep. I mean, maybe in a superficial way, it's not too difficult to understand things dependent on causes and conditions. But if you go really deep, really meditate on that deeply, that can lead to an understanding of emptiness.
I thought Jeffrey, we found out, was referring to Chandrakirti's expanded explanation of what causal dependence is. And then it ended up including all of these somehow. I can't explain it, but it's much bigger than just cause and effect.
Mm-hmm.
I know right, but it wasn't just cause and effect, is what
My understanding from Venerable Children, and it's supported by what I understand from Jeffrey, is that we are to work at causal dependence in order to actually realize emptiness. And then we won't realize the third kind of dependence until after realizing emptiness. And so what's hard for me to understand is is there an understanding of emptiness that isn't complete? And that's where what we're studying now with Jeffrey, that's where I'm kind of lost, actually. That's long and short of what I understood from the last while. And then sometimes in our text, they will use cause, is it the phrase cause and effect, I think? Cause and conditions to refer to all three kinds of dependency. And they broaden it out, but that just depends on the context of the text. But actually, what about realizing emptiness and what level of dependence arising, level of realization of dependence you need to do, that's what I understood.
So in other words, in some texts, that the expression dependent on causes and conditions can
refer to all three types of dependency. In the text that we've been studying, it definitely does.
In his Madhyamika avatar or the clear words?
Yeah, that I don't know about.
As you can see, emptiness is very difficult. Yeah, but we shouldn't give up. Any effort we make to try to understand emptiness is said to be extremely beneficial, very helpful. Okay, next one, number 10. Please elaborate on dependent designation. Does this mean that nothing exists until I give it a name or a label? Well, if that was true, we would have to say atoms didn't exist until human beings discovered them and labeled atom. Pluto, the planet Pluto, didn't exist until it was seen by a human being in a telescope and given the name Pluto. The Big Bang didn't exist until scientists started talking about it. Cancer. I mean, lots of things. Yeah. So it doesn't mean that things don't exist until they are given a name or a label. But how do we answer that? Okay, before human beings discovered and named the planet Pluto, I think there was something there. There was some heavenly body made up of, I don't know, gases and rocks and whatever planets are made out of. And Buddhism would say, well, even if human beings on Earth hadn't yet noticed it and named it, there are other minds. There's lots of other minds in the universe that are aware of things. Like the Buddha. The Buddha knows everything. Buddha sees everything. Aryas, some high-level Aryas. So there are beings who are aware of things that human beings are not aware of. And they can have their own conceptual designations, their own names and labels of things. So they said there's always some mind, some being's mind that is aware of every single phenomena. The thing about saying things are conceptually designated is, I mean, the way I think of it and the way I find it helpful is just to look at our tendency to believe an object, for example, a book, to feel that this is a book. Somehow bookness is here in this object rather than just a label, just a name given to this object. It's almost like talking to us, saying to us, I am a book. From my own side, independently, objectively. So when I look at how my mind sees things, that's very much how my mind sees things. That's a table. That's Venerable Tarpa. That's a refrigerator. That's a computer. Like, they exist in that way from their own side. And these are not just names or labels given to them by human beings. So just to look at that, our experience of things, and realize, well, and like we're asked to, to check if this was a book, if there was a real, inherently, intrinsically existing book in this object, where is it? To look through all the parts, the individual pieces of paper, the blobs of ink, the glue, sticking it all together, look at all the actual parts that are there and try to find something you can point to as a book. And it becomes very hard to do that. So just to see that, I mean, that's as far as I can understand. It's much deeper than that, much more than that. But just to see how our mind operates and seeing things in this mistaken way. Did you have something to say then, Tarpa?
I know when we, in the book, How to See Yourself as You Really Are, His Holiness talks about this. It's probably on page 253. That rings a bell because we've looked this up a few times. He has some comments about this. But for me, what helps me is the way Venerable translates the word objects of knowledge, and she calls it knowable objects. And I find that to be helpful in this, because the idea of that there's a consciousness always aware of everything, every moment. It's always kind of funny, like everybody leaves this room and then everything goes out of existence. It leaves me with that kind of crazy thought. So I really like to think of it more as knowable objects, and that, they're like suitable to be known. Doesn't mean that just works for my mind a little bit better, because that's, I think, one of the definitions is suitable to be known or something like that.
Yeah, and that's another dependency that they say, mind and object are always interdependent. You can never have a mind without an object. There can never be a consciousness and awareness, a moment. I mean, mind is just momentary, these arising and passing moments of experience. So they can never exist without an object. You can never have just bare mind with no object. There's always an object. So mind depends on the object, can't exist without an object, but also object depends on the mind. You can't have an object without a mind knowing it. So they are interdependent. I find that quite intriguing to contemplate.
Even how ultimate and conventional truth are defined, goes back to the mind.
The type of mind that knows them.
Mind that knows them. We always, for me personally, I always think of it like it's that object out there. Doesn't have anything to do with me. It's that object out there, and I'm going to bump into it. But even the definitions take you back to this, like I think he was saying, this 100% subjectivity. Zero objectivity on the side of the object.
Yeah, because what's the definition of existent? Known by a valid cognizer. All those synonyms of existent. Knowable object. It is an object known. Okay, so we've got two more. Number 11, the second and third level of dependence seem very related. How are these different, since we designate independence upon a collection of parts? I think they are related. Yeah. We do designate or label objects in relation to the parts, since everything does have parts. So, but I mean, one easy way to answer this question is they say the second is easier to understand than the third. It's easier to understand how things are made up of parts, especially with physical phenomena like our bodies or computers. We can actually take them apart and look at all the parts. They're directly perceivable. So it's easy to understand that, yeah, if you take the object apart, it's not there anymore. It doesn't work anymore. It doesn't exist anymore as that object without those parts being put together in the right way. With the mind is a little harder because the mind is not a physical thing. So, but mind also has parts, and with meditation, with the practice of meditation, we can become more aware of the parts of the mind. One way is how the mind is a continuum over time. So each moment or each nanosecond, there are different experiences arising and then passing, arising and passing. So we can become aware of that through practicing mindfulness, introspection, watching our mind. And also, each moment of mind, each instance of mind is made up of parts. It has the main mind and then the different mental factors. So mind also has parts, but not so visible, not so obvious, so easy to see unless we do meditation. But anyway, generally, it is easier to understand how things are dependent on their parts. They wouldn't exist if they didn't have those parts. The third way, as we were saying, is more difficult to understand. In fact, real understanding, full understanding only comes after you realize emptiness. That's what I've heard. So that's one difference between the second and the third. And ease of understanding. But the first two, if we really contemplate the first two, which are easier to understand, that leads us to the third. It helps us understand the third, how things are just designated, labeled, dependence on their parts, changing all the time. Well, not changing all the time in the sense of permanent things. Those permanent phenomena, even though they have parts, are not changing moment by moment. So the last question is asking for reference material, a beginner text to study to understand the basis of Madhyamika and all these different topics. So I haven't read this book myself, but I've heard it's very good. It's called Introduction to Emptiness by Guy Newland. Venerable Pende said she liked this book. Yeah, I like the book Insight into Emptiness. Cancer Jampatekchok, edited by Venerable Children, Insight into Emptiness. He's my teacher, so I really like his way of teaching. For me, that book was really helpful. But I haven't read this one, but yes, this is another one. Introduction to Emptiness. How to see yourself as you really are.
Here's the reality for people who might want to look at the tenet system.
Yeah, Appearance and Reality, also by Guy Newland, same author. That's actually going through the 4 schools and how they explain, not everything, but how they mainly how they explain the 2 truths, ultimate truth and conventional truth. I really like that book too. That's one of my favorite books because it's written by a Westerner, written by an American, and with the same kind of questions that we would have. If you read Tibetan texts, like this is a really good text, cutting through appearances, but still, Tibetans have a certain way of writing books and don't always address the kind of questions and doubts and confusions that we come up with. Whereas Appearance and Reality was written by a fellow American, and he studied a lot. He's a student of Jeffries and very knowledgeable. So that's a really good book. But it does kind of go into the different tenet schools. So it is good to look at the different tenet schools. They do present, as Geshe-la said, well, the analogy of a ladder or staircase, that the lower schools, if we understand their way of explaining things, that helps us understand the next one and so on. Because like he said, we tend in our education, we tend to go straight into Madhyamika. Like if we study Lam Rim, often that's the first thing that people study is Lam Rim. That's completely from the Madhyamika point of view. Mostly it's Madhyamika point of view. And so we might get some understanding of Madhyamika and we think, yeah, I understand Madhyamika, but do we really understand it? I don't think we do. I don't think we can unless we go through the lower schools and how they explain things. Then it kind of sheds light onto Madhyamika and why they say the things that they do. So it's fine to jump right into Madhyamika like this book does. But it's also to really understand emptiness, to really understand Madhyamika in a full way, in a complete way. It is important to study the tenets. But all of these topics are difficult, not easy. They do take time, but if we, it's really important to have a good motivation, to have the motivation of wanting to understand these topics so that we can free ourselves from suffering, uproot the main cause of suffering, and be able to help others to do the same. So if we go into it with a good motivation, and even if we find it confusing and puzzling and we come up with more questions all the time, that's my experience, then it's still good. It's still beneficial. I mean, there's no other way to do it except to just go into it and try our best. And as time goes on, things start to become more and more clear. So I've taken care of these questions. Got 2 minutes left if anybody wants to ask something or add something.
Geshe-la said that people often think of searching or finding emptiness as taking apart an object and not finding the object and thinking that's emptiness. But he said that's not emptiness. And I was like, whoa, that's what I thought emptiness was. So can you explain what he meant?
Yeah, I think what he was saying, my understanding was like we take a computer and we don't have to physically take it apart, but just mentally, take it apart, look at all the different parts to it and try to find a computer. And you can't, you realize, well, not one single part is the computer. So computer is just named onto this collection of parts. And yeah, so people might do that and think, oh, that's the meaning of emptiness. I understand emptiness. That's not too difficult. Yeah. So there, what we're doing is we're simply looking for the conventional computer, conventionally existing computer. So to really understand emptiness, we have to be, like they say, the very first step is identifying the object of negation, identifying the thing to be negated. The thing to be negated isn't the conventionally existing computer, it's an inherently existing computer. Or in our case of our self, our I, it's the inherently existing I, which in fact doesn't exist, but it does appear to our mind. It is an appearance to our mind all the time. Whenever we think I, whenever we feel I, whenever we have a sense of I, it's always inherently existing I. So we have to be able to catch a glimpse of that object, inherently or intrinsically existing I. That's what we are to be looking for when we search through the parts of our body, our mind, and whatever, or with the computer. When we see the computer, we see an inherently existing computer. not just a computer, but inherently existing computer. So we have to identify that, how the computer appears to be inherently existing, and then look for that. And it's only when you do that that you get to the understanding of emptiness. That makes sense? But they say that first step of identifying the object of negation is the hardest. Really. I say once you can get that, the rest is easy. But that first step is so difficult because it's the way we see everything all the time since we were born and even in past lives. Our mind is like glued to that way of seeing things. So it's really hard to step back from that and recognize, oh, that's how I see things. That's how things appear to be inherently existing. It's extremely difficult. But yeah, have you heard that before? That once you can recognize the object of negation, it's so easy to refute it. So I think Geshe-la was saying that, yeah, if you haven't recognized the object of negation, the inherently existing I or the inherently existing cup or computer or whatever it is, and you just look through the parts and try to find the object, that's not a realization of emptiness. That's not an understanding of emptiness. Okay, so we'll stop there. I hope this hasn't made you more confused.